I like to keep a miter saw in my shop for cross-cutting wood because it requires very little setup. I can cross-cut any length of wood that I wouldn't dream of cutting on a table saw, and it's very intuitive to use. Unfortunately, this saw is so intuitive to use that you can forget how dangerous it really is. For example, when I plunge the saw to cut a board, you can see how much of the blade is actually exposed. If your hand was too close to that, you're opening yourself up for a possible injury. That's why manufacturers mark their miter saws with what they call no-hand zones. One on the left, one on the right. You should never have your hand anywhere between them when you're cutting a piece of wood. Like with any power saw, be sure to unplug this miter saw before changing blades. And of course, always wear eye protection and hearing protection because a miter saw is one of the loudest tools in your shop. Now let me tell you a little bit about how a miter saw works. A miter saw gets its name because it makes angled cuts, called miters, up to 45 degrees left and right, and some models even go beyond that. When you talk about a compound miter saw, it means a saw that will make these miter cuts, but it will also, the head will tilt to make a bevel cut up to 45 degrees, and again, some models go a little beyond that. You can also buy a dual bevel saw which bevels to the left and to the right, but when you tilt the head this far you need to have clearance so the fences slide out to make room and then slide back for when you need support on 0-degree bevel cuts. You should also consider how much cutting capacity you need. A 10-inch compound miter saw cuts about 5.5 to 6 inches wide, and a 12-inch compound cuts about 8 inches wide. And a sliding miter saw is cut in the neighborhood of 11.5 to 12.5 inches wide. Regardless of whether you have a sliding miter saw or a compound miter saw, the technique for cutting is the same. First, mark your board, slide it up tightly against the fence. If it's longer than your table, then you need to support it with either the wing extension on your saw or an outfeed support stand. Now some saws will have lasers that will help you to line this up. This saw does not, so what we're going to do is line up the teeth right on the waist side of the mark, just short of the line, and then we're going to make our cut. If you're like me, you'd rather cut your board just a little bit long rather than a little bit too short. So I like to err on the side of caution. I'll show you a tip here that will help you to sneak up on a cut. The teeth on a saw blade are just a little bit wider than the body of the blade. So what we're going to do is push the head of the saw down, take your workpiece, hold it tight against the fence, and then push it against the body of the blade. Hold it firmly so it won't move. Now as you raise the saw blade, you'll feel the teeth drag, so that when we cut, we're going to remove just that thin little difference. And if that's not enough, you can just repeat it and do the same thing again. And there we go. Earlier we talked about the no hands zone for safe cutting, but you can't see those marks when you've got your board on the table. So what my dad always told me was to hold the board against the fence and then wrap a finger or two around the end of the fence or around the end of the table to help keep my hand clear of the blade. I've got this miter saw set up to cut crown molding lying flat on the table. The miter angle is 31.62 and the bevel angle is 33.9. But it's not very intuitive, and sometimes it's hard to hit those angles precisely. Here's a simpler way to do it. I like to set the bevel angle at 0, set my miter at 45, and then cut the crown in the position as it would appear on the wall. Cutting crown molding like this is easy, and it requires a simple jig, and you can find out more about the technique in Wood Magazine or at woodmagazine.com.